The audience is so fragmented now, and there's such a battle for ratings, and with so many cable outlets, it's hard to imagine that they're not somehow affected by the money they need to bring in. It's, I think, high time that we had a source for news, like the Real News Network, where you can just count on it not being influenced, because there's no way that it can be.
Welcome to the next segment of our interview with Leo Panitch. Leo's a professor of political science at York University in Toronto and Canada Research Chair in Comparative Political Economy. We're talking about Canada, the recession, and whether a stimulus package will be effective. Thanks for joining us again.
Hey, Paul.
Before we get into the stimulus question, I want to take you up on something you said in the first segment of the interview, which was the bailout of the banks in the U.S. and in Europe was necessary. The critique of that bailout is that that money could have been, the liquidity that was needed in the system could have been done by direct loans to homeowners, to small businesses, and that a lot of that bailouts had just been misused. It's in fact, instead of freeing up liquidity, it's gone to dividends, it's gone to buyouts, mergers particularly. Are you saying the way that bailout was done had to be done, or that something had to be done?
Well, I think that insofar as that banks don't lend to each other, and they weren't lending to each other in a market economy where money is the means of exchange, the economy collapses. The credit system really matters. Had there been runs on the banks, handing the money over to people would have simply led to them having no access to the money in the first place. I mean, they don't put it under mattresses; they put it in bank accounts. So it was an enormous crisis. And the trouble is that despite all of this, the banks are still very reluctant to lend even to each other. And what that's about is that they've gotten so used to the system they developed over the last 2-3 decades of selling off the risk of the loans they make to consumers, to homeowners, to businesses. They take that risk and they repackage it. And they sell it around the world in these derivative securities. Some of them are called mortgage-backed securities, different kinds of asset-backed securities, et cetera. And that has seized up. It hasn't seized up completely. It's still operating in currency markets, less so in commodity markets.
Should that bailout have been done without some kind of government ability to tell them what they had to do with the money?
What even the Financial Times is now saying is that there's been a strong case for a long time that banks should be a public utility. They can't exist in a modern society without government deposit insurance. Increasingly over the last 30 years, they've depended on central banks as lenders of last resort to come in every time there's been a bank failure, right, and prevent the contagion.
So why couldn't they let the banks fall but keep the liquidity going through the central bank and creating other instruments for doing that, and let the banks fall?
It would be a revolution. I mean, it's a class thing, Paul. Ownership and control, pass through the banking system. And, this would be removing one of the main pillars of capitalist power. It also had enormous implications in terms of could you do this without exchange controls and capital controls being reintroduced? Could you do it given that so much of the American debt the Chinese are holding was not only in treasury bills, it was also in Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac mortgage securities and in the kinds of mortgage securities that are being held in the investment banks. So it was partly being responsible as the global state of global capitalism that the Americans couldn't do this. It was a big thing. But the trouble now is, and this relates to this crisis that's happening in Canada, that it's not yet clear whether the opposition parties have taken on board that even with a big stimulus, if banks aren't lending, and if every firm is laying off workers or cutting back their workers' wages, they're cutting back demand, and banks aren't lending, then what governments can do in terms of a fiscal stimulus may not be enough to offset this. So that's the seriousness of this crisis.
And if that is the case, does that mean there has to be even more role for government in terms of both lending money directly and in terms of stimulus, creating jobs through massive infrastructure projects?
For instance, It was the Brown government that led the American government, in fact, in terms of saying, well, it's not enough just to pour liquidity in, and it's not enough just to take up some of their bad debt. We've actually got to recapitalize the banks, and we'll buy shares in the banks. In this statement, even the Tory government in Canada said if absolutely necessary, they would do that. And they did that. And now the British government owns 58% of one of the largest banks in Britain, but it owns very large chunks, really a controlling amount of shares in 3 or 4 of them. But when the Bank of England, the week before last, reduced interest rates by 1.5% in one go, the banks didn't follow. And the government was reduced to moral suasion, pleading that they should also reduce rates. Now, and they didn't. Not immediately in any case. And the reason that the government gave for why they weren't able to do that was that, yes, they were shareholders, but they had pledged that all they wanted as shareholders was that the bank should operate on purely commercial criteria in a prudential way, et cetera, so the taxpayer as a shareholder would get maximum value for its investment. But that it wasn't undertaking any direct executive control over the banks. So the capital they put in has not been nationalization. A lot of people have said it has nothing to do with that. And it may come to that. As I said, even the Financial Times in a recent editorial said if the banks don't start lending, then we really may have to have public ownership of the banks.
And just force them to lend, or just directly lend through some government institution.
And that's why here in Canada, the Liberal finance critic, John McCallum, as these negotiations were going on to put together a coalition, the first thing he said was that the financial sector didn't have to fear that this coalition would harm it. Right? That's why every journalist who writes a column in the Canada's national newspaper is pointing out the importance of the deal in terms of it saying that the finance minister would be a Liberal. Heaven forbid that Jack Layton, who's leader of the Social Democratic Party here, the NDP, might be finance minister, although during the election campaign he also pledged not to run a deficit.
Or if you look at any of the NDP provincial governments, I don't think the financial sector had anything to fear from them.
But, you know, they were very worried that this political crisis in Canada would further disturb the markets.
In the next segment of the interview, let's talk about why banks don't want to lend. Please join us for the next segment of our interview with Leo Panitch. Endless wars, abuse of powers, declining living standards, and the climate change crisis. The stakes couldn't be greater in the U.S., and with your help, we're moving our news operation to Washington, D.C. We'll focus on money and corruption. For example, big oil and arms companies shape American economic and foreign policy with far-reaching effects on the lives of ordinary people. With allies in government, trade unions, the media, and in think tanks, they're a hidden hand that controls the commanding heights of American politics. Taking on the industrial military complex is what real change requires. Even former presidents and high administration officials have said so. But corporate television news treats such positions as marginal. Uncompromising journalism requires questioning assumption, interrogating structures of wealth and power. Corporate TV news just won't do it. Only a news organization that's truly independent can tackle such issues with courage and tenacity. And we'll take on corporate TV news live. You'll watch TV news with our panel of writers, journalists, scientists, and historians. You'll be able to join in by phone, webcam, chat. Together, we'll discuss and debate what's the real story and take on the myth and the propaganda. But this is only possible if you support us now. We need to prove that a viewer-funded model works. So if you want the real news, we need you now. Please click on the donate button and give generously. Now's the time to decide if you want the real news to thrive.
Your tax-deductible donation makes it possible. Please contribute at therealnews.com.